July 1942. Warsaw, Poland. The summer sun barely pierced the gray haze that clung to the city like a shroud. Cobblestone streets rattled under the wheels of German trucks, their engines a constant, ominous hum. Jan Karski, a 9-year-old courier for the Polish underground, crouched in the shadow of a crumbling tenement, his heart hammering against his ribs. Each day brought new patrols, new regulations, and new horrors. Yet Karski moved with a careful, studied precision, honed by months of clandestine operations. Sweat beaded at his temples, mixing with the soot and grime of a city that had once known vibrancy and laughter. He adjusted the strap of his satchel, the weight of forged documents and secret messages pressing against his side. The papers within were more than ink on paper. They were lifelines, warnings, evidence that could pierce the deafening silence of the world. Karski's assignment was as perilous as it was impossible: to infiltrate the ghettos and camps where the Nazis carried out systematic annihilation, gather irrefutable proof, and deliver it to the Allies. Every step outside the familiar walls of safe houses carried the risk of a German patrol, a betrayed contact, or a sudden, indiscriminate execution. By late afternoon, the streets grew quieter, the distant drone of Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes slicing through the air. Karski slipped into a narrow alley, its walls blackened by years of neglect. Eyes scanning for the telltale signs of SS inspections. Each encounter with a German officer demanded a precise combination of calm and defiance. Even a tremor in the voice could unravel months of preparation. Yet his mind was not only on survival. He remembered the faces from previous missions, families torn apart, children clutching to the frail hope of bread, elderly men and women beaten into submission. These were not abstractions. These were the human beings whose lives depended on his courage and ingenuity. At dusk, Karski approached the outskirts of the Warsaw Ghetto. Guard towers loomed over crumbling tenements, the armed sentries scanning the streets below with brutal indifference. From a safe distance, he observed the throngs of people pressed into a space too small for human dignity. Children's cries echoed through narrow passageways. Adults shuffled along like ghosts, their eyes hollow, haunted by hunger and fear. Karski knew that stepping inside meant risking not only capture, but the immediate and lethal judgment of the occupying forces. He waited until the patrols shifted and the shadows deepened. A Polish contact, a wiry man named Marek, slipped a bundle of false papers into Karski's hand. "They are watching closer than ever," Marek whispered. "Trust no one. Move fast." Karski nodded, the weight of responsibility settling over him like armor. Every step was a negotiation with fate. One misstep could be fatal. One hesitation, catastrophic. Yet, within the chamber of fear, a spark of determination ignited. He would enter the ghetto, witness its horrors firsthand, and live to carry the truth beyond these walls. Slipping through a broken gate and into the shadowed lanes of the ghetto, Karski moved like a phantom. He passed rows of overcrowded tenements where families had been packed together with no space to breathe, and the air was thick with the stench of despair. Children played quietly among rubble, their laughter muted, their innocence stolen by the relentless machinery of the Nazi regime. Men and women labored under the gaze of armed guards, forced into tasks that served the occupiers' war machine. Every alleyway seemed to whisper the same truth. Life here was measured in fear. Survival, a fragile thread. Inside a courtyard, Karski witnessed a scene that would sear itself into his memory. A young mother clutched her infant as soldiers confiscated her meager belongings, shouting and striking with brutal efficiency. The child's wails pierced the heavy air, a sound of pure terror that echoed across the crumbling walls. Karski clenched his jaw, forcing his hands to remain still, his expression neutral, while his heart ached with the knowledge that words could barely convey. Every second here was a testament to the cruelty of those who had seized control, yet also to the resilience of those who endured. He spent hours moving quietly, speaking with hidden contacts who described deportations to camps beyond the city, the systematic stripping of identity, the liquidation of families. Karski documented every detail in his mind and in the notes he managed to conceal. Aware that the smallest slip could result in death, his thoughts were interrupted only by the occasional shout of a guard, the harsh slap of a boot on stone, or the frantic rustle of someone trying to hide contraband food. Each moment demanded composure, vigilance. As night fell, Karski slipped back through the ghetto gate, the moon casting a pale glow on streets emptied of their daytime suffering, yet haunted by shadows. The weight of what he had seen pressed down, yet he knew the most dangerous journey lay ahead. The evidence he carried was volatile, explosive in its truth. The courier's life was expendable. The truth, however, could not be. By midnight, Karski was back in a safe house on the edge of Warsaw, the quiet punctuated only by distant gunfire and the murmurs of a city under occupation. He sat at a wooden table, unrolling the papers, reviewing the hidden details committed to memory. Each line, each observation, carried the weight of human suffering and the urgency of moral responsibility. He knew the journey ahead to London, to Washington, would challenge every skill, every nerve, every ounce of courage he possessed. Yet, in that moment of silent reflection, Jan Karski understood the magnitude of what he had begun. The world had not yet heard the full extent of the atrocities, and he would be the one to deliver that unflinching testimony. The mission had begun, and there was no turning back. August 1942. Southern Poland, near Lwów. The early morning mist clung to the fields, heavy with the scent of damp earth and smoke from distant skirmishes. Jan Karski crouched low behind a stand of birch trees, listening intently to the crunch of boots along the gravel road. German patrols were unpredictable, their schedules erratic, and the slightest miscalculation could mean immediate death. His satchel, tightly secured across his chest, contained meticulously documented accounts from the Warsaw Ghetto, names, numbers, locations, and methods of deportation. Each piece of information was a potential spark for action, yet each also carried the risk of annihilation if discovered. For weeks, Karski had planned his route, memorized the terrain, and coordinated with resistance contacts to cross from German-occupied Poland into territories where Allied couriers could more safely transport him toward London. Every step was fraught with danger. Landmines hidden in fields, SS checkpoints, collaborators, and the ever-present risk of betrayal. He moved like a shadow across the countryside, avoiding roads and villages, guided by the dim light of a crescent moon. The night air was sharp, carrying whispers of unseen life, the occasional cry of a fox, or the distant rumble of artillery that had long ceased to distinguish friend from foe. As he approached the town of Lwów, Karski paused, blending into the crowd of civilians trudging to work under German supervision. Factory whistles blew in the distance, masking the rhythmic patter of soldiers' boots and the shuffle of laborers. Karski's eyes scanned the square, noting the positions of guards and the expressionless faces of townspeople, many of whom had learned to walk with eyes averted, a survival mechanism honed under occupation. In a small bakery, he exchanged a subtle nod with a resistance operative, receiving a coded message that the route through the forest to the rail line remained safe for the next 24 hours. Timing was everything. Delay could mean interception, capture, or death. The rail line itself was a gauntlet. Karski had to hide among coal shipments and livestock carriages, moving under the noses of German inspectors who were trained to detect even the faintest irregularity. He entered a small siding under the cover of darkness, slipping beneath a wooden platform, feeling the cold metal of freight cars press against him as a train rumbled past. Each vibration threatened to expose his presence, yet he forced himself to remain perfectly still, listening to the metallic screech of wheels and the muffled shouts of soldiers. Survival depended on patience, discipline, and an unwavering nerve. Crossing into forests and meadows after leaving the rail line, Karski encountered groups of refugees, their faces pale and drawn, carrying children or meager possessions. Some recognized him and whispered encouragement. Others avoided his gaze, fearful of German informants. He offered a word of reassurance when he could, but each encounter reminded him of the stakes, the lives at risk, the truth that needed to escape the grasp of the Nazis. Even a brief interaction could endanger his mission, yet he could not ignore the humanity around him. By the second night, Karski reached a river that marked the unofficial boundary between German-controlled Poland and areas patrolled less aggressively. He had to swim across, dragging the satchel above his head, water numbing his limbs, currents threatening to pull him downstream. The sounds of distant German patrols mixed with the rush of water, a chaotic symphony that mirrored the tension coursing through his body. Exhaustion clawed at his muscles, but he forced his will forward. The mission demanded nothing less than total commitment. Reaching the opposite bank, he collapsed briefly, catching his breath and scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. Safe, for the moment, he pressed on through the forest toward the next rendezvous point with Allied contacts. The landscape was alien and intimidating in its silence, every snapped twig a potential alarm. He relied on intuition and intelligence from the underground network, navigating through swamps, past abandoned villages, and over ridges scarred by recent skirmishes. Each mile was a testament to endurance, courage, and the unforgiving reality of wartime Europe. He documented mentally every observation, every detail that could be corroborated for eventual reports: mass graves, signs of deportation, camps being expanded, the eerie absence of normal life. At dusk, Karski reached a small cabin where a local resistance cell awaited. Inside, they shared bread and whispered updates. The Nazis had intensified their searches, raiding villages for contraband and suspected couriers. The urgency of Karski's mission became even more apparent. The Allies needed to understand the scope of the atrocities before more lives were lost. Karski reviewed the notes he had committed to memory, cross-referencing details with his maps. Each piece of intelligence was more than information. It was a moral imperative, a call for action that had yet to reach those in power. After a brief rest, Karski departed the cabin, moving under the cloak of darkness toward a railway junction leading westward. He had to blend with local workers, avoid German inspections, and utilize every skill in disguise, evasion, and silent observation. His thoughts drifted to the Warsaw Ghetto. The faces of children and mothers, the hollow-eyed men he had seen laboring under Nazi oversight. Every step forward was fueled by the memory of those souls, their suffering lending him courage he did not know he possessed. Reaching the junction, Karski slipped into the shadows of an empty freight yard. Steam hissed from idle locomotives, masking the sounds of his careful movement. He observed the schedule, calculating the next train that could carry him safely to neutral or Allied-friendly territories. The journey ahead was not only physical but psychological, carrying the unbearable weight of first-hand knowledge of the Holocaust, knowing that the world's disbelief could render his efforts futile. By dawn, Karski had boarded a train bound for Krakow, the city slowly waking beneath the soft orange light of morning. His muscles ached, his skin was smeared with mud and grime, yet he felt a grim satisfaction. He had crossed hostile territory, survived patrols, navigated rivers, and evaded detection. More importantly, he carried with him the unflinching truth of the ghetto, a truth that must reach London, Washington, and the leaders capable of halting or at least acknowledging the systematic annihilation of millions. As the train rattled toward the west, Karski leaned against the wooden bench, eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Trees, fields, and distant villages blurred in the morning light, yet his focus remained unwavering. Every mile carried him closer to his goal, yet also deeper into the moral weight of his task. The world needed to hear what he had witnessed, and he would be the one to deliver it, no matter the cost to body or spirit. He tightened his grip on the satchel, knowing that the next days would demand all his cunning, endurance, and resolve. The journey across Poland was perilous, but the mission had only just begun. September 1942. The early morning fog clung to the low wooden barracks of the transit camp, muting the groans and cries of prisoners that seemed to seep from every corner. Jan Karski crouched behind a row of dilapidated crates at the perimeter, the cold metal of his forged papers pressed to his chest like a talisman. The scent of smoke, sweat, and human despair was nearly unbearable. Yet he inhaled it as a necessary prelude to witnessing what the world could not yet fathom. Guards patrolled with mechanical indifference, rifles slung across shoulders, boots striking the earth in a relentless cadence. Any misstep, any hesitation, and Karski would vanish into the machinery of death that had claimed countless others before him. Slipping past the outer fence required the coordination of local contacts who had mapped weak points, times when guards shifted, or gaps in the watchtower rotations. Karski moved with a calculated rhythm, heart pounding as he counted the steps between crates, low walls, and sentry positions. Beyond the fences lay rows of barracks crammed with people. Jews, Poles, Roma stripped of their possessions, their dignity, and, increasingly, their hope. Their eyes followed him as he passed, some recognizing the subtle gestures of resistance, others too exhausted to register anything beyond the daily struggle for survival. Inside, the camp was a grim echo of the ghetto's horrors, but magnified by systematic organization. Their gaunt faces illuminated by the weak light filtering through the wooden slats, Karski observed the cruel efficiency. Men, women, and children moved in strict lines under the barking orders of German officers and Ukrainian auxiliaries. He witnessed families torn apart in seconds, parents separated from children, men segregated from women, the elderly forced to the back of the line where disease and starvation had already begun their deadly work. The sight seared itself into his memory. Karski knew his mission demanded both courage and subtlety. Every conversation had to be carefully measured, every gesture controlled. He spoke with a few prisoners in whispered Polish, careful not to attract attention. They described deportations to Belzec, mass shootings in the surrounding forests, and the small, systematic cruelties that compounded into unimaginable suffering. Each testimony confirmed what Karski had feared and more. The industrialized nature of the killings, and the deliberate targeting of every demographic that the Nazis deemed undesirable. Navigating deeper into the camp, Karski encountered a young boy sitting alone, dirt streaked across his face, eyes wide with terror. He extended a hand, offering a small piece of bread he had managed to conceal. The boy hesitated, then grasped it, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Karski felt a mix of sorrow and resolve. This act, small in the grand scheme of survival, was a reminder of the humanity still possible in the heart of unimaginable cruelty. Witnessing these private moments of anguish strengthened his determination to carry the truth beyond the camp's gates. He paused in a corridor where prisoners were forced to scrub floors under the watchful gaze of guards. The rhythmic scraping of brooms, punctuated by occasional blows, formed a perverse cadence, a soundtrack to the oppression surrounding him. Karski noted the meticulous documentation of arrivals and departures, the coded records that would one day serve as evidence. He memorized names, numbers, and locations, recording everything in his mind and encoded notes hidden within the lining of his coat. Accuracy was paramount. The Allies would not act on vague reports. The details had to be indisputable. Karski's movements took him to the edge of a fenced enclosure, where he observed the first mass deportation he had ever seen in person. Trucks arrived, engines roaring, and prisoners were loaded with mechanical precision. The air vibrated with the cries of those being separated from families, the barked commands of guards. Karski kept a low profile, recording every detail, every reaction, every human face he could capture, without exposing himself. This moment crystallized the unimaginable scale of the genocide. It was organized, relentless, and horrifyingly normal to those who executed it. Inside the camp kitchen, Karski saw the meager rations doled out under supervision. He watched as women tried to hide scraps for their children, as men exchanged portions in quiet solidarity. These small acts of defiance and care were the only glimpses of dignity in a place built to strip humanity from every prisoner. Karski absorbed these scenes with a sense of urgency. The world outside had no conception of this daily reality. Every detail he could relay might make the difference between indifference and action. As night fell, the camp took on an even more sinister aspect. Shadows stretched across the barracks, and the cries of the dying became more pronounced, a grim lullaby to the horror that had become routine. Karski found a small corner to rest, hidden from guards, and reviewed the mental notes he had taken. The scale of operations, the types of prisoners, the methods of execution, the logistics that made the mass killings horrifyingly efficient. The weight of what he had seen threatened to crush him, yet he knew that panic or despair was a luxury he could not afford. He whispered a silent vow to the countless lives trapped within the fences. He would carry their stories, their pain, and their humanity beyond Poland's borders. He would testify not just to numbers and procedures, but to faces, voices, and the unbearable loss of innocence. Karski understood that the Allies' disbelief was inevitable, but the moral imperative was absolute. If he failed to deliver this testimony, the world would remain ignorant while millions perished. Before slipping back into the forest under cover of darkness, Karski made one last observation of the camp from a concealed vantage point. Smoke from makeshift fires twisted into the night sky, mingling with the scent of blood, excrement, and human suffering. Each wisp was a reminder of the scale and immediacy of the horror. Emerging from the shadows, he paused at the tree line, listening to the night and the distant, hollow echoes of a camp built on despair. The journey ahead would be perilous, the Allies distant and uncertain. Yet he carried within him the voices of those who had no choice, whose survival rested on his ability to traverse borders, oceans, and the skepticism of powerful nations. The night air was cold against his face, but it carried with it the imperative of truth. He would warn the world. He vanished into the forest, a lone witness armed with knowledge the world was not ready to hear. October 1942, Krakow. The early morning fog hung low over Krakow railway station, masking the rust-streaked tracks and the sparse patrols of German soldiers. Jan Karski moved quickly through the shadows, the satchel of memorized horrors and written evidence strapped tightly across his chest. Each step along the platform carried the risk of discovery. Guards paused now and then, their eyes scanning for irregularities, and Karski held his breath, feeling every heartbeat reverberate through his chest. He adjusted the brim of his hat, a simple gesture to mask the tension, and melted into a group of civilians boarding a train westward. The journey itself was treacherous. Karski slipped into a freight carriage, crouching among crates of coal and timber, listening to the metal groan as the train shuddered forward. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails became a sinister heartbeat, each vibration a reminder of the precariousness of his mission. Overhead, moonlight filtered through slats, illuminating fleeting glimpses of fellow travelers, some unaware, some fellow couriers masked in the anonymity of civilian life. His mind raced with the details from the Warsaw Ghetto and the transit camp. Names, numbers, scenes of unspeakable cruelty. Every piece of information needed to survive the journey intact. Crossing into territories patrolled by German collaborators required careful coordination with underground networks. Karski memorized the coded phrases, the secret handshakes, and the narrow paths through forests and back roads that led to safety. At one stop, a partisan emerged from the shadows, whispering instructions to follow a concealed track through a dense thicket. He ducked beneath branches, the low-hanging boughs scraping against his coat, and pressed forward, muscles screaming from exertion. The night seemed endless, the forest alive with the distant crackle of gunfire and the calls of nocturnal animals. By daybreak, Karski had reached a small village on the edge of the border, where Allied sympathizers awaited. They guided him past German checkpoints with forged papers and brief whispered conversations. One slip could have meant immediate capture and certain execution. Yet Karski's resolve was unwavering. The evidence he carried was more than intelligence. It was the lifeline of truth for millions of suffering souls. He rested briefly. A loaf of bread passed silently across a wooden table, and then resumed his trek toward the airfield that would take him out of Poland. At the airfield, the shadows of waiting aircraft loomed like predators. Karski, accompanied by a contact, navigated past uniformed sentries, each step measured, deliberate. The propeller of a waiting plane spun slowly in the early morning light, the noise masking the faint rustle of footsteps behind crates and luggage. Once aboard, he collapsed into a seat, allowing himself a momentary respite. The engines roared to life, lifting him toward neutral territory and closer to London, the heart of Allied operations. Crossing the continent was no less perilous. Radar sweeps, Luftwaffe patrols, and the threat of interception were constant companions. Karski kept his satchel close, fingers brushing the edge of his notes, ensuring that nothing could be lost or discovered. He recalled the faces in Izbica, the hollow eyes, the hands clutching thin blankets, the silent endurance of those trapped in unimaginable horror. Every memory reinforced the urgency of his mission, a burden heavier than any physical obstacle. By the time the plane crossed the English Channel, dawn illuminated the patchwork of countryside below. Karski peered through the small window, observing the landscape and considering the journey still ahead. London was a sanctuary, but it was also a city bracing for constant attack, scarred by bombings and alert to every threat. And now he carried a cargo of truth that demanded attention from leaders who had yet to grasp the enormity of the Holocaust. Arriving in London, Karski was whisked through the labyrinthine streets to a safe house run by Polish government and exile operatives. The city hummed with wartime activity, air raid sirens, soldiers moving in formation, and civilians navigating the realities of rationing and blackout regulations. Karski, still cloaked in the dust and grime of his journey, recounted his experiences to intermediaries who would arrange meetings with officials and military intelligence. Every word was precise, every detail corroborated, every story meant to pierce the veil of disbelief that enveloped even the most informed Allied leaders. In a quiet room, Karski met with Jan Sichanowski, the Polish ambassador to the United Kingdom. Maps were spread across a wooden table, each line, railway, and border carefully annotated. Karski described in measured tones the horrors he had seen: overcrowded ghettos, systematic deportations, the efficiency of the transit camps, and the industrialized killings at the far end of the network. Sichanowski listened intently, occasionally asking questions for clarification, his face a mixture of shock, concern, and cautious skepticism. Karski's voice never wavered. He delivered his testimony with a precision born of necessity and a moral urgency that could not be ignored. The next days were consumed with briefings to British intelligence officers, journalists sympathetic to the Polish cause, and diplomats capable of influencing policy. Karski repeated his account, each time adding nuance, each time confronting the disbelief that met his description of extermination. "Are you certain?" one officer asked, his tone a mixture of doubt and hope. "I saw it, I lived it. If you do not act, millions will perish." The room fell silent, the gravity of the statement settling like dust over every listener. Despite the intensity of these meetings, Karski's work was far from complete. He knew that reaching Washington and delivering the testimony to the American leadership was the ultimate objective. The journey across the Atlantic was perilous, fraught with U-boat patrols and the constant threat of aerial attack. Yet Karski did not waver. Each step, each flight, each meeting carried the responsibility of the lives he had witnessed being destroyed in occupied Poland. The Allies needed irrefutable proof, and he was determined to provide it. London, with its war-torn streets and air raid shelters, became a temporary sanctuary where Karski could rest, review his observations, and prepare for the next leg of the journey. Yet the images of the Warsaw Ghetto and Izbica Lubelska haunted him. Even amidst the relative safety of Britain, the cries of children, the hollow eyes of the elderly, and the mechanical cruelty of guards echoed relentlessly. Karski understood that testimony alone might not change minds, but it was the only weapon he had against the abyss of human indifference. As he packed his notes and prepared for the journey to the United States, Karski reflected on the enormity of the task ahead. He carried with him not only evidence, but the moral imperative to make the world confront a horror unprecedented in scale and in brutality. Every mile crossed, every border traversed, every moment of danger endured was justified by the lives at stake. The path ahead was uncertain, but Karski was resolute. The world must know, and he would be the one to ensure it. The mission had moved from observation to testimony, and the stakes had never been higher. January 1943. Washington, D.C., United States. The winter chill cut through the streets of the capital, snow crunching under boots as Jan Karski was escorted through a side entrance to the Polish embassy. Inside, the air was warm but tense, filled with the quiet urgency of wartime diplomacy. Karski's eyes, still haunted by the ghetto and camp, scanned the room as he prepared to recount the horrors he had witnessed in words that many found impossible to believe. The polished floors, the ornate furnishings, and the quiet hum of the city beyond felt alien compared to the smoke-choked alleys of Warsaw or the crowded barracks of Izbika Lubelska. Karski was introduced to key officials and advisors, each carrying the weight of global conflict on their shoulders. Among them was a young aide who would later recount how Karski's presence brought an almost tangible gravity to the room, a quiet insistence that demanded attention. The courier spoke deliberately, painting a vivid picture of systematic annihilation, deportations, and the industrialized nature of the killings. He described the ghetto's crowded streets, the despair etched on faces of children and adults alike, and the chilling efficiency of the transit camps. Every word was chosen to convey not just facts but the human suffering behind them. As he recounted the details of Izbika Lubelska, Karski described families torn apart in seconds, prisoners forced into labor under brutal conditions, and the constant presence of death as an almost normalized aspect of daily life. Officials exchanged uneasy glances, scribbling notes, occasionally interrupting with questions that reflected both skepticism and dawning comprehension. "Are you certain of these accounts?" one asked, his voice betraying disbelief. Karski's response was calm but unwavering. "I saw it with my own eyes. I spoke to the victims. I survived to tell you because someone must." Despite the clarity of his testimony, the room was heavy with incredulity. The scale and methodology of the Holocaust were unlike anything most Western officials could imagine, and even first-hand accounts clashed with the limits of their understanding. Karski pressed on, speaking of rail transports, the role of local collaborators, and the systematic categorization of victims. He recounted every observation with precision, occasionally pausing to allow the weight of his words to sink in. The officials in the room were forced to confront not just numbers or reports, but the undeniable human suffering that accompanied them. One moment stood out. Karski described a mother clutching her child as soldiers confiscated her possessions. He paused, letting the silence speak as much as his words. Some aides shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the magnitude of the cruelty becoming momentarily visible on their faces. Karski continued, detailing the organized deportations to extermination camps, the construction of gas chambers, and the methodical documentation maintained by the Nazis. It was not just a story of brutality, but of a meticulously executed plan to annihilate millions. After hours of discussion, Karski was taken to meet President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The meeting was brief but intense. Karski's voice, calm yet resolute, conveyed the unimaginable scope of the atrocities, the urgency of action, and the moral imperative that could no longer be ignored. Roosevelt listened, occasionally leaning forward, eyes fixed, absorbing the narrative of suffering, courage, and desperation. Karski's testimony was more than a report. It was a plea, a moral summons to the world's most powerful leader, to recognize and confront a genocidal machinery operating in plain sight. In private briefings with State Department officials, Karski emphasized the immediacy of the situation. Time is not on their side, he insisted, recalling the meticulous deportations, the assembly line efficiency of killing, and the near-total lack of outside awareness. Officers struggled to reconcile the reports with their own preconceived notions of warfare. Karski's insistence on accuracy, his vivid recollections, and the human faces he described forced listeners to confront a reality that no previous intelligence briefing had prepared them for. Despite the gravity of his accounts, Karski encountered disbelief and bureaucratic inertia. Advisors questioned whether action was feasible, whether the reports could be verified, or whether the scale was being exaggerated. Karski responded with unwavering certainty, recounting his own journey, the contacts he had met, and the meticulous records he had memorized and carried across borders. His narrative was compelling, grounded in first-person observation, yet the enormity of the truth made it difficult for officials to fully comprehend. During meetings with journalists sympathetic to the Polish cause, Karski recounted vivid scenes from the ghetto. Children scavenging for scraps, elderly prisoners forced to march under threat of execution, and the relentless presence of German overseers ensuring every act of terror was executed efficiently. Journalists took detailed notes, some struggling to reconcile the humanity of the victims with the mechanical cruelty of their oppressors. Karski emphasized that these accounts were not fiction, not exaggeration, but reality, the lived experiences of millions whose voices had been silenced. Karski's journey through Washington continued over several days. Each briefing, each meeting, carried with it a mounting weight, the moral urgency to spur recognition and action. He described every aspect of life under Nazi occupation: the ghettos, the transit camps, the rounding up of families, the separation of men from women, the cold efficiency of death. Officials began to piece together the full magnitude of the systematic extermination, the reality of a genocide that was unprecedented in its scale and horror. Despite the initial skepticism, Karski sensed that seeds of awareness were taking root. He saw the flicker of understanding in the eyes of key decision-makers, the shift from disbelief to cautious acknowledgement that the Holocaust was not a distant atrocity, but a present and deliberate campaign. Karski's role as a courier had transcended information delivery. He had become a bridge between the unimaginable reality of Nazi-occupied Poland and the political and military leaders who could respond. As he prepared to depart Washington, Karski reflected on the journey that had brought him here from Warsaw to Izbica, across Europe through forests, railways, and oceans. Each step had been perilous. Each moment weighed with the responsibility of truth. He carried the faces, the names, and the suffering of those he had witnessed into the corridors of power, knowing that history would judge both the perpetrators and those who ignored the warning. Karski left Washington with a resolve as unyielding as ever. He had delivered the message, and now the world had no excuse to remain blind. February 1943. London, United Kingdom. The rain fell steadily over London, blurring the edges of the bomb-scarred streets and the rooftops huddled under a gray sky. Jan Karski walked briskly toward the Foreign Office, the satchel containing his eyewitness reports of Auschwitz and other extermination camps pressing against his side. He was greeted with polite nods and measured smiles. But beneath the civility lay a wall of skepticism that seemed impossible to breach. The officials listened, taking notes, asking cautious questions, yet their expressions betrayed doubt, disbelief, or the mental inability to process what Karski had lived through. Karski recounted the Warsaw Ghetto, describing the suffocating overcrowding, the hunger etched into every child's face, the systematic stripping of identity and humanity. He spoke of the transit camps, where families were separated and forced into labor or death. Yet each vivid description seemed to meet a cold barrier. "Are you certain?" one diplomat asked. "We have reports, but they cannot confirm the scale." Karski's jaw tightened. Confirmation from distant sources mattered little. He had seen it himself. He could not repeat himself with less intensity, and repeating the horrors made each memory a fresh wound. The room felt colder, the shadows longer. Karski's words painted a world that many did not want to see. He spoke of trainloads of human beings packed into cattle cars, of fires consuming entire sections of cities, of mass graves dug with mechanical precision. He emphasized that these were not isolated incidents, they were systematic, deliberate, and industrialized. Still, the faces of the officials remained neutral, a mask of diplomacy and disbelief. Some scribbled furiously. Others remained silent, the weight of denial almost palpable. During a meeting with British military intelligence, Karski presented maps he had memorized, tracing the locations of camps and transport routes. He detailed the methods of execution and the organizational machinery that ensured efficiency. He recounted stories of children hiding under blankets, mothers whispering lullabies to block out the cries of others, men forced into grueling labor under the watch of armed guards. Every anecdote, every figure, every geographic marker was meant to convey the urgency and scale. Yet the response remained frustratingly restrained. Disbelief. The bureaucratic caution of men, unwilling to imagine the full scope of horror. Even sympathetic officials struggled to absorb the testimony. Karski could see it in their eyes, a mixture of horror and incredulity, the human mind resisting truths too vast to easily comprehend. "We cannot act without verification," one said, his voice clipped but not unkind. Karski understood. He had expected resistance. The world's leaders were inundated with intelligence, propaganda, and rumors. To believe him fully required abandoning comfort, acknowledging that millions of human beings were being methodically annihilated while the world hesitated to respond. Undeterred, Karski pressed on. He described the psychological torment inflicted upon prisoners, families stripped of all agency, the constant threat of death, the humiliation inflicted upon men, women, and children alike. He spoke of the quiet courage of those who helped each other survive, the brief flashes of humanity in a sea of cruelty. He conveyed the faces he had seen, the hollow eyes, the sunken cheeks, the fear etched into every movement. Each detail was selected to pierce the armor of doubt, to make the unimaginable tangible. The meetings extended over days. Karski repeated his testimony, sometimes verbatim, sometimes emphasizing new details or human stories that illustrated the scale of atrocities. Officials asked questions about numbers, logistics, and the credibility of his sources. He responded with patience, recounting the clandestine methods of verification used by the Polish underground, the meticulous notes memorized and carried across occupied territories, and the direct conversations he had with prisoners. Yet still, the shadow of disbelief lingered. Karski experienced the frustration that comes with moral urgency colliding with bureaucratic caution. He understood the difficulty of his task. These men were trained to analyze data, weigh evidence, and avoid rash decisions. But he also knew the stakes: millions were dying while the world hesitated. He pressed forward with quiet determination, emphasizing that delay was complicity, that verification could not precede action without cost in human lives. Every moment of resistance to belief was another moment for the Nazis to continue their genocidal operations. In private, Karski confided in a trusted aide, speaking of the exhaustion that came not from physical danger but from the weight of disbelief. "They hear but they do not see," he said, the strain evident in his voice. "They understand the words, but not the faces behind them." His own memory of the ghetto and transit camp remained vivid, a constant companion that fueled his resolve even as it tormented him. The psychological burden was immense, yet he refused to let it weaken him. The truth had to be delivered. Despite setbacks, Karski began to notice subtle shifts. Officials, previously cold or skeptical, started asking more pointed questions about the logistics of camps, the process of deportation, and the sources of his information. The more precise he was, the harder it became for them to dismiss him. He reinforced his testimony with tangible evidence: descriptions of camp layouts, lists of victims, transport records, and carefully observed details that could be corroborated. These concrete points began to bridge the gap between disbelief and grim comprehension. Karski also reached out to journalists who could amplify his testimony. He shared harrowing stories of life under Nazi control, ensuring the accounts were accurate and verifiable. Some reporters were visibly shaken, the reality of what he described challenging the limits of what they could imagine. Newspapers and radio coverage offered a conduit for the broader public, but even these channels were constrained by the scale of disbelief and the difficulty in conveying the enormity of industrialized murder. By late February, Karski realized that persistence was his only ally. The disbelief he encountered was not willful ignorance, but the natural human resistance to accepting horrors beyond ordinary comprehension. He adjusted his approach, emphasizing the precision, corroboration, and direct observation of his accounts. He relied on emotion sparingly, trusting that the undeniable factual weight of his testimony would eventually break through. At the end of each day, Karski returned to a modest safe house, reviewing notes, mapping camp locations, and rehearsing the testimony anew. His body ached from travel, his mind burdened by memory, yet his resolve hardened. The faces of the victims fueled every word, every pause, every response to doubt. He had survived danger in occupied Poland to bring the truth to the world. Now, he had to survive disbelief to ensure that truth might inspire action. Karski left London with the grim understanding that witnessing atrocities and delivering testimony were not enough. The world's attention was fragile, its comprehension partial. The burden of proof weighed heavily. Yet he carried it with a sense of moral necessity. Disbelief would not stop him. March 1943. The rain-slicked streets reflected the dim glow of gas lamps as Jan Karski hurried through the maze of bombed-out neighborhoods, each step a reminder of the war's pervasive reach. Inside a small, sparsely furnished safe house, he sat alone at a wooden table, the satchel of notes and memorized details spread before him. The weight of what he had witnessed pressed on him with relentless intensity. The crowded, suffocating lanes of the Warsaw Ghetto, the methodical cruelty of transit camps, the faces of children and adults etched with despair. He ran his hands over the papers, a tactile connection to the memories that refused to fade. Karski understood that his role was unique, singular. He was not merely a messenger. He was a living conduit between the dead and the world of the living. Each detail he carried was irreplaceable. Each observation, a testament that could not be reconstructed if lost. He reviewed mental notes again, rehearsing the description of camp layouts, deportation procedures, and the industrialized machinery of death. Every number, every name, every structural detail had to be flawless. Even the smallest error could undermine the credibility of an already incredible story. The psychological toll was immense. Karski often awoke in the night, images of terrified children, broken families, and the relentless efficiency of the Nazi killing machine replaying in his mind. Sleep was fragmented, haunted by the cries and whispered prayers of those who could not survive. He recorded everything he could in secret, sometimes in code, sometimes relying solely on memorization, knowing that exposure of even a single page could jeopardize not only himself but also those who had assisted him. He reviewed the testimony he had delivered to Allied leaders in Washington and London. Faces of skepticism lingered in his memory, polished diplomats, military officers, and aides whose disbelief was both a barrier and a reflection of human limitation. Karski recognized that skepticism was a predictable human reaction to horror of unprecedented scale. Yet he also understood that repeated, precise, and corroborated testimony could gradually break through doubt, compelling action where inertia had prevailed. In the quiet hours, Karski revisited the faces he had seen in Izbika Lubelska. Mothers clutching infants, men forced to labor under the gaze of guards, elderly prisoners weakened by hunger and disease. He traced their contours in his mind with painstaking care, committing their expressions and voices to memory. Each recollection was a moral imperative. The world could not act on abstractions alone. It needed witnesses who could translate the ineffable suffering into comprehensible, undeniable evidence. He also contemplated the logistical challenge of translating his observations into actionable intelligence. It was not enough to describe atrocities. He had to ensure the Allies could verify locations, numbers, and methods. Maps, train schedules, records of deportations, and memorized sequences of events became his arsenal. Karski methodically cross-referenced each item, aware that credibility hinged on precision. The Nazis' bureaucratic thoroughness could be used against them if the Allies understood the systematic nature of the crimes. The nights were the hardest. Karski often ventured onto the fog-laden streets of London, pacing in silence, absorbing the rhythm of a city at war but far removed from the annihilation he had witnessed. He imagined the millions still trapped under Nazi control, the factories of death operating unchecked, the trains moving relentlessly toward extermination camps. The moral weight of survival bore down on him. He had lived to deliver testimony, but the act of survival did not absolve him of responsibility. Despite the isolation, Karski drew strength from small victories. Moments when officials asked informed questions, when journalists conveyed his accounts with accuracy, when maps he had memorized aligned perfectly with intelligence reports. These glimmers of recognition provided the reinforcement needed to continue, to endure the constant mental strain. Every interaction, every brief acknowledgement of credibility, was a vital step toward breaking the wall of disbelief. Karski's role required him to embody both observer and advocate, a dual responsibility that was psychologically exhausting. He could not simply report. He had to inspire action through testimony, evidence, and the moral weight of first-hand experience. He spent hours practicing the narrative, refining emphasis, and preparing to revisit officials who had previously expressed doubt. Each rehearsal was both a strategic exercise and a coping mechanism, a way to anchor himself amidst the relentless mental replay of horror. He also considered the broader consequences of his testimony. Allies had to comprehend not only the human suffering, but also the strategic implications, the moral urgency of halting or disrupting the Nazi extermination program, the ethical responsibility to intervene, and the potential influence on public opinion. Karski's work was not passive observation. It was active engagement in shaping responses that could alter the course of history. Letters, coded messages, and meetings filled the daytime hours. Karski coordinated with resistance networks to ensure that additional intelligence could supplement his testimony. Every message reinforced the scale of atrocities, the locations of camps, and the ongoing deportations. He worked tirelessly, driven by the knowledge that every day's delay cost human lives. The weight of being the sole bearer of unfiltered truth was immense, yet he bore it without complaint, fueled by necessity and conscience. By the end of the week, Karski recognized that his endurance, persistence, and meticulous documentation were beginning to crack the barrier of disbelief. Officials were beginning to grasp the mechanized nature of the genocide, if not yet its full moral enormity. Karski allowed himself a brief, private acknowledgement of this incremental progress, understanding that the task ahead remained monumental, but that every detail carried the potential to galvanize action. He returned to his safe house one evening, gazing at the fog rolling over the city, aware that millions of lives depended on his ability to persist. The weight of witness was heavy, crushing even. Yet it was also a mantle of moral responsibility that he would carry without hesitation. Karski's resolve crystallized. He would endure disbelief, navigate bureaucracy, and continue to testify until the world could no longer ignore the horrors he had survived. The burden of being the world's reluctant messenger had become both a torment and a mission. April 1943. London, United Kingdom. The streets were slick with rain, the low hum of wartime traffic underscoring the city's restless energy. Jan Karski sat in a modest office, reviewing sketches and notes from his missions, the faces of the Warsaw Ghetto and Izbika Lubelska pressing upon him like ghosts. Each figure, the mother clutching her child, the young boy hiding beneath a blanket, the elderly man forced into labor, was etched in memory with unbearable clarity. Karski knew that numbers alone could never convey the scale of suffering. Only the faces, the voices, and the human stories could pierce through disbelief and stir moral urgency. He arranged photographs smuggled from contacts within occupied Poland, careful to protect their sources. The images depicted crowded streets, guarded fences, and emaciated prisoners, Yet they captured only a fraction of what he had witnessed firsthand. Karski studied each face, recounting in whispered tones the circumstances behind them, the fear, the courage, the stolen moments of dignity amidst relentless terror. These were not abstractions or statistics. They were living, breathing people whose survival had been stolen and whose deaths must not be forgotten. In meetings with Allied officials, Karski emphasized the individuality behind the mass atrocity. He described a father quietly teaching his child a lullaby under the cover of night, a woman sharing her meager bread with neighbors, prisoners forming secret networks to aid one another. Each story served a dual purpose: to humanize the victims and to demonstrate the systematic cruelty of the Nazi regime that sought to erase such humanity. Officials listened, their skepticism slowly giving way to discomfort, recognition, and the dawning comprehension of the scale of genocide. Karski also recounted moments of extraordinary resilience. In the ghetto, he had seen children playing quietly among rubble, inventing games to preserve a sense of normalcy. In transit camps, prisoners whispered encouragement to one another, offering solace in fleeting moments of shared suffering. These glimpses of courage and humanity were what Karski clung to, a mental lifeline that sustained him amid the darkness of memory. He pressed officials to recognize that the Nazi aim was not only to kill but to erase identity and humanity, making every act of defiance, however small, profoundly significant. During one briefing, Karski described a mother who had hidden her child from guards, cradling the infant beneath her coat despite the risk of immediate execution. The officials flinched at the detail, their faces betraying the visceral impact of his account. "It is impossible," one whispered, yet Karski persisted. "I saw it. I cannot invent the fear, the courage, or the despair." He conveyed not just events, but the emotional weight of survival, insisting that the Allies could not ignore these human stories in favor of abstract numbers. Karski's notes were meticulous. He had memorized the layout of transit camps, the schedule of deportations, the hierarchy of command within the camps, but he supplemented these with vivid human accounts to ensure officials could grasp the human cost. Each individual story was a thread in the tapestry of genocide, illustrating the scope, the methodology, and the indomitable spirit of those who endured. He understood that while leaders could debate logistics, only the human element could compel urgent moral and political response. He often revisited the story of a young boy he had encountered in Izbika Lubelska, alone and trembling, with nothing but fear and a small piece of bread Karski had given him. That boy had clung to hope despite the daily presence of death. Karski recounted the boy's wide, terrified eyes, the way he clutched the bread to his chest, and the trembling hands that betrayed both fear and resilience. The officials, silent, were forced to confront the tangible reality of children caught in the machinery of annihilation, a reality far beyond the abstractions of intelligence reports. In private reflection, Karski grappled with the emotional weight of his mission. He could not fully process the trauma he had witnessed without acknowledging the personal cost. Nightmares, moments of despair, and an unshakable awareness of mortality. Yet he channeled this anguish into clarity, precision, and relentless dedication to documenting every human story with fidelity. The faces of victims became both his compass and his burden, guiding every meeting. Karski also recounted moments of moral courage among prisoners. A man sharing his blanket with a stranger, a woman quietly hiding a child in a barracks corner, the subtle defiance of prisoners who maintained cultural rituals in secret. These acts, though small, illustrated a defiance of totalitarian cruelty and preserved the human spirit. Karski emphasized that these stories were essential. They were proof that the Nazis sought not just to kill but to obliterate humanity itself. In subsequent meetings with journalists and diplomats, Karski made deliberate efforts to convey the emotional and psychological landscapes of those he had witnessed. He described the despair of separation, the terror of deportation, the anxiety of living under constant surveillance, and the quiet dignity of prisoners who retained their humanity against overwhelming odds. His testimony was more than intelligence. It was a bridge to empathy, compelling recognition of atrocities that were otherwise unfathomable. Even among those who were skeptical, Karski's human stories left an imprint. Officials who had initially questioned the scale of atrocities began to ask about specific individuals, about families, about children. Karski provided names, locations, and circumstances, anchoring abstract numbers in real lives. His insistence on humanizing the victims transformed disbelief into tentative acknowledgement, forcing listeners to see genocide as not only a statistical tragedy but a profoundly human one. Karski's evenings were spent cross-referencing maps, memorized notes, and newly received intelligence. He labored to ensure that every story, every face, every minute detail was as accurate as possible. The human dimension of his testimony was inseparable from the operational details, and he understood that credibility and compassion had to coexist if his warnings were to provoke moral and strategic response. As he prepared for further briefings, Karski allowed himself a brief, private reflection on the faces that had become inseparable from his conscience. Each face represented not only tragedy, but also the moral imperative that drove him forward. The world had yet to respond adequately, yet he carried their stories, their fear, and their courage like a sacred obligation. His role as witness, messenger, and moral advocate was not merely a task, it was a covenant with those who could not speak for themselves. The faces of the victims would accompany him relentlessly, shaping every word, every meeting, and every step of the journey that remained ahead. May 1943. London, United Kingdom. The fog rolled over the Thames, a heavy, damp blanket that seemed to echo the tension in Jan Karski's mind. He navigated the narrow alleyways leading to a secure government building, the rain slicking cobblestones reflecting dim lamplight. Every meeting mattered. Every briefing was a chance to pierce the wall of bureaucratic skepticism and ignite the moral urgency required to act. Karski's mind was a catalogue of horrors. The Warsaw Ghetto's crowded alleys, the transit camp's barracks, the faces of mothers and children, the relentless mechanization of death. Each recollection fueled his determination to compel action. Inside the briefing room, Karski laid out maps, lists, and mental notes with careful precision. He recounted the systematic deportation schedules, the trains packed with families, the organization of labor assignments, and the assembly of extermination camps. His voice, measured but unwavering, painted a landscape of industrialized cruelty, emphasizing that these were not sporadic acts of violence, but a coordinated genocide. Officers scribbled furiously, some nodding in acknowledgement, others skeptical but attentive. The tension in the room was palpable. The weight of truth hung heavy in the air. Karski emphasized immediacy. He described the unrelenting rhythm of the transports, the precision with which the Nazis separated children from parents, men from women, the elderly from the young. He reminded officials that every day without intervention was another day that millions were lost. Questions arose about logistics, verification, and the credibility of the reports. Karski responded with calm authority, citing first-hand observation, corroborating evidence from the Polish underground, and the memorized details that had guided his perilous journey across occupied Europe. The human dimension remained central to his testimony. Karski recounted the quiet courage of prisoners' acts of compassion in the midst of despair. He spoke of the mother shielding her child from guards, of prisoners sharing meager rations, of the fleeting moments of humanity that persisted despite constant surveillance and brutality. These details were intended not just to shock, but to humanize the victims, forcing officials to confront the individual lives behind abstract numbers. The skepticism of bureaucrats was a persistent barrier. Karski understood their hesitation. It was difficult to comprehend the scale of industrialized extermination, the meticulous organization, and the sheer inhumanity. Yet he also understood that delay equated to complicity. Every logistical detail he provided was meant to anchor the testimony in reality, making the unfathomable tangible and undeniable. In private moments, Karski reflected on the psychological toll of his mission. The memories of Izbika Lubelska, the cries, the despair, the exhaustion etched into faces remained vivid. Sleep was elusive. Haunted by the recollections of children, families, and the relentless machinery of death. Yet Karski transformed these burdens into resolve, channeling grief and horror into a disciplined, relentless pursuit of advocacy. The weight of urgency was inseparable from the weight of witness. Each briefing was meticulously prepared. Karski rehearsed the sequence of events, the organization of camps, the methods of extermination, and the human stories he would highlight. He understood that precision, credibility, and empathy were essential tools. Numbers alone would not suffice. The moral weight of his first-hand accounts was what could break through skepticism and catalyze response. Officials needed to grasp both the scale and the human cost. Karski also coordinated with journalists to ensure broader dissemination of the truth. He provided factual accounts, verified details, and human stories, trusting that the press could amplify the moral imperative for awareness and action. Some journalists were visibly shaken. The reality of Karski's observations challenged the limits of their imagination, yet these channels were crucial in building pressure, creating a network of accountability, and ensuring that disbelief could not indefinitely shield the Allies from responsibility. In the evenings, Karski revisited his mental maps, retracing the paths he had taken across occupied Poland. He reviewed the layout of ghettos, the arrangement of barracks, the location of deportation points, and the daily routines imposed by the Nazis. Every detail had strategic importance. Every observation could corroborate additional intelligence. He prepared to reinforce his testimony with these meticulously recorded details, ensuring that every briefing was both emotionally compelling and factually indisputable. The moral weight of urgency became a personal crucible. Karski recognized that survival alone was insufficient. Testimony had to translate into action. The Allies' disbelief, however understandable, was a luxury the victims of the Holocaust could not afford. He resolved to continue his efforts, leveraging every encounter, every document, and every human story to convey the immediacy of the crisis. The clock of extermination ticked relentlessly, and Karski carried the burden of sounding its alarm. He also focused on establishing networks for continued verification and reporting. The Polish underground provided intelligence, maps, and eyewitness accounts that complemented his own observations. By integrating this data, Karski aimed to fortify credibility and reduce the space for doubt. Each corroborating detail strengthened the moral and strategic argument, creating a foundation for eventual action. Despite the relentless pressure, Karski found fleeting moments of reflection. He imagined the lives that might yet be saved, the families spared, the children who could live if the world acted decisively. These thoughts sustained him, providing purpose and resilience in the face of bureaucratic inertia and disbelief. The weight of urgency was not merely a professional responsibility. It was a moral imperative, an obligation to those who could no longer speak. By the end of May, Karski sensed that his persistence was gradually penetrating the wall of doubt. Officials were beginning to acknowledge the scale and immediacy of the atrocities. Karski's testimony had become both an archive of human suffering and a call to conscience, a weapon against indifference that demanded recognition, understanding. The weight of urgency would guide every subsequent step, shaping the trajectory of his mission and the moral imperative he carried across continents. June 1943. London, United Kingdom. Thunder rumbled over the city as Jan Karski walked briskly along the rain-drenched streets. The muffled roar of wartime industry in the distance, blending with the patter of water on cobblestones. Each step brought him closer to the Foreign Office, each breath a reminder of the enormity of the task he carried. Karski had witnessed atrocities that defied comprehension, and now his role was no longer just observation. It was advocacy, a moral imperative to ensure that the Allies understood the full scope of Nazi extermination and could act to prevent further loss of life. Inside the briefing room, Karski spread out maps, photographs, and memorized sequences of events, each piece designed to convey both scale and human suffering. He described the Warsaw Ghetto, the transit camps, the calculated efficiency of deportations, and the industrialized methods of extermination. Officers and diplomats listened intently, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, horror, and the dawning comprehension that these events were systematic, not anomalous. Karski's voice remained calm, deliberate, and unwavering, the cadence of each word carrying the weight of lives lost and lives yet to be saved. He emphasized the moral dimension of the crisis. "These are not abstract numbers," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "These are people. Mothers, fathers, children. They are being erased from history before our very eyes." He recounted specific instances: a mother hiding her child beneath a thin blanket, families separated on the platforms of a transit camp, men forced into backbreaking labor under constant surveillance. Each story was carefully chosen to humanize the victims, to make the incomprehensible reality tangible to those in positions of power. Karski's insistence on precision reinforced his credibility. He cited the schedules of deportation trains, the layout of camps, the hierarchy of command within the Nazi apparatus. His mental maps were as detailed as any intelligence dossier, yet they were animated by the faces and voices of those he had encountered. The combination of rigorous data and human testimony created a compelling narrative, forcing officials to confront both logistical and ethical dimensions of the Holocaust. Resistance to belief persisted, yet Karski recognized the subtle shifts. Officials who had initially questioned the feasibility of mass extermination now asked about transport routes, camp infrastructure, and sources of intelligence. The skepticism was not entirely vanquished, but curiosity and concern were taking root. Karski responded with meticulous clarity, recounting his own infiltration of the Warsaw Ghetto and transit camps, the details he had memorized, and the corroboration provided by the Polish underground. He also highlighted the urgency. The Nazis were not pausing. Deportations continued, camps expanded, and extermination proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Delay was not neutral. It was a continuation of genocide. Karski's testimony was imbued with moral urgency. The Allies had to recognize that understanding the horror was only the first step. Action was the necessary response. Without decisive measures, the machinery of death would continue its relentless course. Karski provided concrete examples of the operational systems used by the Nazis. He described the coordination between train schedules, local collaborators, and camp authorities, the meticulous records kept for the purpose of systematic extermination, and the predictable patterns that could allow intervention or documentation. By framing atrocities within a logistical context, he reinforced the credibility of his accounts and underscored that the Holocaust was not random, but deliberate, organized, and preventable. The human dimension remained central. Karski recounted acts of courage and resilience. Prisoners sharing food, comforting children, or quietly defying orders to maintain a sense of identity and dignity. These details emphasized that Nazi objectives extended beyond murder. They sought to erase culture, morality, and hope. By highlighting these small acts of humanity, Karski forced officials to see the stakes beyond statistics, the annihilation of human spirit itself. In private reflection, Karski grappled with the psychological toll of his mission. The memories of the ghetto, of transit camps, and of those he could not save weighed heavily, pressing against the edges of consciousness. Sleep was haunted by images of faces, cries, and moments of despair. Yet Karski converted this burden into focus, channeling grief into precise testimony and deliberate advocacy. Each briefing became an act of moral defiance against indifference and disbelief. He reinforced the necessity of action through repeated briefings, coordination with journalists, and consultation with intelligence officers. Every session was an opportunity to reduce skepticism, strengthen credibility, and highlight the immediacy of the threat. Karski understood that moral imperative demanded persistence, repetition, and clarity. the enormity of the crime could not be conveyed once and forgotten. Karski also worked to ensure that evidence could withstand scrutiny. Details from the Polish underground, corroborating eyewitness testimony, and memorized observations were systematically cross-referenced. The goal was not only to inform, but to equip leaders with irrefutable evidence, making dismissal or delay increasingly difficult. Accuracy became a weapon in the battle for moral attention and eventual action. The psychological weight of carrying these stories was immense. The city's fog reflecting his inner turmoil, the cries of those he had witnessed echoing in his mind. Yet he remained resolute, understanding that endurance, clarity, and unwavering dedication were essential to fulfilling his moral responsibility. By the end of June, Karski's persistence had begun to yield subtle results. Officials were increasingly attentive, journalists more receptive, and the moral imperative was slowly being acknowledged, if not yet acted upon. Karski recognized that the mission demanded not just testimony, but relentless advocacy, each interaction reinforcing the reality that the world could no longer turn away. The moral imperative was clear. Bearing witness was insufficient without compelling recognition and action. Karski's task was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for the world to hear, understand, and confront the unimaginable. July 1943. The London docks were shrouded in a damp fog, the sound of waves crashing against rusted hulls mingling with the distant hum of wartime industry. Jan Karski, clad in a plain overcoat, moved briskly through the shadows, his satchel of memorized testimony pressed against his side. The journey across the Atlantic was perilous, with U-boats prowling the waters and Allied convoys under constant threat. Yet Karski's determination was absolute. The truth he carried could not remain confined to European shores. Boarding a troop transport bound for New York, Karski found a small corner among the cargo and equipment, away from the prying eyes of naval officers and crew. The vessel's timbers groaned with each swell, waves slapping against the hull, and the scent of salt and diesel filled the air. He closed his eyes, rehearsing his testimony silently, retracing every alleyway, barracks, and face from Warsaw to Izbica. The Atlantic was vast, but Karski carried the immediacy of Polish ghettos and camps in his mind, the weight of human suffering as palpable as the rolling deck beneath him. During the voyage, Karski maintained strict vigilance. Any casual conversation with other passengers risked exposure. Any misstep could compromise not only his mission, but the lives of those who had assisted him. He memorized every detail anew, cross-referencing maps, transport schedules, and escape routes, ensuring that if notes were discovered, he could reconstruct the entirety of his testimony from memory alone. The Atlantic storms mirrored his inner turmoil, each swell and lurch a reminder of the precariousness of his journey. The nights were the hardest. Waves pounded the hull, the wind cut through the narrow sleeping quarters, and Karski's mind was alive with images of the Warsaw Ghetto and transit camps. He visualized the crowded alleys, the gaunt faces, the mothers clutching their children, the cries echoing through barracks. Sleep came in short bursts, fragmented by the relentless awareness that he carried the story of millions whose voices had been silenced. Yet each recollection reinforced his resolve. Survival without testimony was meaningless. The world needed to see, hear, and understand. Crossing the Atlantic also meant navigating bureaucratic and linguistic obstacles. Karski rehearsed his story in English, refining phrasing and cadence to maximize clarity and impact. Each word had to be precise, every description anchored in detail, every anecdote grounded in verifiable observation. The journey was more than physical. It was mental preparation, a continuous sharpening of the narrative that would confront disbelief and compel recognition. Upon arrival in New York Harbor, the skyline emerging through morning mist felt alien yet urgent. Karski disembarked, the weight of the Atlantic behind him, but the urgency of the mission intensified. Safe houses, intermediaries, and resistance contacts awaited, ready to guide him through a city already consumed with wartime priorities. Karski moved with purpose, understanding that each meeting, each briefing, carried the potential to influence decision-makers who could act to halt the Nazi machinery of death. The city was alive with activity. Factories producing war material, soldiers marching in formation, and civilians navigating ration lines and blackout regulations. Yet beneath the surface of everyday life, Karski carried the extraordinary weight of genocide, a burden invisible to most but searingly real to him. He rehearsed his testimony during brief walks through crowded streets, each step an exercise in endurance, focus, and moral resolve. In meetings arranged by the Polish government in exile, Karski recounted the full extent of Nazi atrocities. He described the Warsaw Ghetto's labyrinthine streets, the inhumane conditions of transit camps, and the meticulous organization of extermination facilities. Officials listened, some incredulous, others visibly disturbed, as he delivered precise, verifiable, and humanized accounts. The combination of logistics, first-hand observation, and vivid human stories made disbelief harder to sustain. Karski also engaged with journalists, sharing carefully documented narratives that balanced factual accuracy with the emotional weight of personal testimony. Reporters, initially skeptical, were often shaken by the specificity and immediacy of his accounts. Karski emphasized that each statistic represented a life, a face, a story. The press became a conduit for amplifying his mission, extending the reach of his testimony beyond closed governmental doors to a broader public conscience. Each day in New York, Karski navigated the tension between advocacy and security. The Nazi threat was ever present. Spies, informants, and collaborators could compromise his mission. Yet he persisted, leveraging contacts to arrange meetings, secure lodging, and protect sensitive materials. His every move was calculated, a balancing act between efficiency and safety. As he prepared for meetings with American officials, Karski rehearsed each detail, visualizing the layout of camps, the faces of victims, and the sequence of atrocities. He understood that the emotional and logistical precision of his testimony could bridge the chasm of disbelief, compelling recognition and, potentially, action. Each repetition, each consultation, sharpened the moral clarity of his mission. By the end of July, Karski had established a rhythm in New York. The Atlantic had been crossed, but the challenge remained, ensuring that the world not only heard, but believed, not only knew, but acted. The journey across the ocean had transformed from survival to moral advocacy, each mile a step toward exposing the unimaginable truth. August 1943. The heat of summer pressed against Washington streets. The hum of wartime industry. A constant backdrop as Jan Karski made his way to the War Department. Inside the office, the polished floors and rigid decor belied the enormity of the testimony that was about to unfold. Karski's footsteps echoed with a purpose honed over months of perilous travel, clandestine observation, and relentless briefing. He carried with him not just maps, notes, and memorized testimony, but the faces and voices of thousands whose stories demanded acknowledgement. Karski began with precise logistics: the layout of ghettos, the organization of deportation schedules, the structure of transit and extermination camps. He traced routes on maps with meticulous detail, describing the movements of trains, the separation of families, and the hierarchy of Nazi command. Yet the human dimension was never absent, he recounted, mothers whispering lullabies under guard surveillance, children hiding in corners, elderly prisoners enduring relentless labor. Each anecdote anchored the abstract numbers in palpable reality, forcing listeners to confront the tangible cost of inaction. Questions arose immediately: the credibility of sources, the veracity of numbers, and the feasibility of corroboration. Karski responded with unwavering clarity, citing first-hand observation, corroborating accounts from Polish underground networks, and memorized records he had carried across borders. He emphasized that these were not rumors but lived experiences, meticulously documented and transported through perilous channels to ensure accuracy. Skepticism lingered, but Karski's precision left little room for dismissal. Officials shifted in their seats as Karski described the mechanization of extermination, gas chambers, crematoria, the methodical scheduling of deportations. He recounted specific instances that illustrated both cruelty and resilience: a father shielding his child, prisoners sharing meager rations, secret acts of cultural preservation amid systemic destruction. Each story underscored the dual nature of the Holocaust. It was both industrialized murder and an assault on humanity itself. Karski sensed subtle changes in demeanor. The officer's initial detachment began to give way to comprehension, a mixture of horror, disbelief, and dawning moral recognition. They asked for more detail: locations, train schedules, lists of victims. Karski provided exactitudes, drawing on memorized intelligence, maps, and corroborating reports from underground networks. The factual precision made the enormity of the atrocities undeniable, gradually piercing the veil of bureaucratic skepticism. He emphasized urgency. The machinery of death did not pause for deliberation. Deportations continued, camps expanded, and lives were extinguished with relentless efficiency. Delay was not neutral, it was complicity. Karski's testimony was as much a moral imperative as an intelligence briefing. He demanded recognition that understanding the atrocities was insufficient without immediate action to mitigate further loss of life. Throughout the sessions, Karski employed every tool at his disposal: detailed logistics, vivid human stories, corroborating evidence, and moral clarity. He conveyed not just data but the emotional and ethical weight of the crisis. The officials could no longer regard the Holocaust as an abstract or distant event. Karski's testimony rendered it immediate, undeniable, and morally imperative. The breakthrough came gradually. Officers began connecting Karski's detailed descriptions to existing intelligence, corroborating schedules, and reports. The human stories lent urgency to statistical data. Conversation shifted from polite skepticism to strategic and ethical consideration, as Karski's combination of precision and humanization forced a confrontation with reality. He recounted the story of a mother in Izbika Lubelska, cradling her child while being forced toward deportation. Officials were silent, absorbing the enormity of what such moments represented: a systematic attempt to annihilate not just bodies, but humanity itself. Karski emphasized that these were not isolated tragedies, but the core of a calculated genocide, demanding recognition and immediate moral response. By the end of August, Karski had secured meetings with high-level officials and aides who understood both the factual content and the moral weight of his testimony. The disbelief that had greeted him months earlier had given way to recognition. The Holocaust was real, methodical, and urgent. Karski's persistence, precision, and courage had begun to break through layers of bureaucratic detachment and incredulity. He knew the work was far from complete. Awareness did not guarantee action, but it was the first essential step. Karski's role as a witness had transformed into that of a catalyst, compelling the world to confront the unimaginable and forcing leaders to consider the moral consequences of inaction. The journey from Poland to Washington had been arduous, fraught with danger, disbelief, and moral weight, but Karski had delivered the message with unflinching clarity. As he left the War Department, the sun setting over the Potomac, Karski felt the quiet satisfaction of partial victory. The truth had finally penetrated the walls of skepticism. The Karski 5W War, the human stories had been acknowledged, and the moral imperative could no longer be ignored. His mission, though not yet complete, had begun to resonate. Karski had finally broken through the veil of disbelief, ensuring that the world could no longer remain blind to Auschwitz and the atrocities he had witnessed firsthand. September 1943. Warsaw, Poland. The city remained under the iron grip of occupation, streets scarred by previous uprisings and lined with rubble from relentless bombing. Jan Karski returned briefly in spirit through the memories that had propelled him across continents: the crowded alleys of the Warsaw Ghetto, the guarded barracks of transit camps, the faces of mothers and children who would never see liberation. Though he had carried their stories to the world, their suffering was a constant reminder of the stakes, and the urgency of bearing witness had never lessened. Karski reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Infiltration of the ghetto, clandestine travel through occupied Poland, delivery of memorized testimonies to Allied leaders in London and Washington. Every perilous step, every risk taken, had been fueled by a single imperative: the preservation of truth and the imperative to alert the world. He understood that courage was not measured by acts of battle alone, but by the willingness to confront disbelief, bureaucratic inertia, and the sheer horror of human cruelty. In the halls of Allied offices, Karski's presence had shifted perceptions. Leaders who once doubted the plausibility of mass extermination now had vivid images, precise logistics, and human stories anchored in first-person observation. His testimony had planted seeds of recognition. The moral weight of eyewitness accounts, compelling officials to consider the scale and immediacy of genocide. The road from skepticism to acknowledgement had been slow, but Karski's persistence had carved a path where doubt could no longer dominate. He understood that the true measure of success lay not in recognition alone, but in the potential to inspire action, however incremental. The photographs, maps, and meticulous notes had given credibility to his accounts, while the human stories ensured that those numbers represented lives, families, and irreparable loss. Karski's courage had been the vessel through which these realities traveled across oceans and offices, transforming abstract reports into undeniable moral imperatives. As he contemplated the faces of those he had witnessed, Karski recognized the duality of his mission: the act of survival itself and the act of transmission. Survival allowed him to bear witness. Transmission transformed his experiences into testimony capable of piercing disbelief and demanding moral reckoning. The weight of this dual responsibility was immense, yet it had forged him into a messenger whose impact would extend far beyond the immediacy of wartime diplomacy. Karski's journey exemplified the extraordinary capacity of individual courage to confront systemic evil. Alone, he navigated forests, checkpoints, and enemy lines. He infiltrated ghettos and transit camps. He memorized sequences, faces, and structures that others could not fathom. Yet it was the unwavering commitment to truth and moral responsibility that elevated these acts beyond espionage or intelligence work. They became a testament to human conscience confronting inhumanity. The broader significance of his mission extended to the historical record. Karski's detailed testimonies would inform both contemporaneous policy discussions and future understanding of the Holocaust. His precise recollections, combined with the emotional depth of first-hand accounts, established a bridge between raw human experience and strategic, moral, and political analysis. Through him, the world gained not only knowledge, but the moral context necessary to comprehend the magnitude of Nazi atrocities. Even in private moments, Karski's thoughts returned to the individuals whose lives had been extinguished, the mothers, fathers, and children whose courage and suffering had fueled his mission remained central to his consciousness. He acknowledged that remembrance was inseparable from action. Bearing witness was both tribute and obligation. Each story he carried was a call to conscience, a reminder that silence in the face of evil perpetuates tragedy. Karski's courage was also a lesson in persistence. Confronting disbelief and bureaucratic inertia required resilience as demanding as any physical confrontation. He had faced skepticism, moral hesitation, and procedural barriers at every step. Yet he persisted, knowing that the consequences of inaction were measured in human lives, and that moral clarity demanded both patience and unwavering resolve. As the autumn light fell over occupied Warsaw, Karski reflected on the arc of his mission. He had traversed perilous terrain, crossed continents, and confronted disbelief at the highest levels of government. The truth of Auschwitz and other extermination camps had been delivered into the hands of those who could influence awareness, policy, and historical record. His role as a witness was not complete. The struggle for recognition and justice would continue. Yet in this moment, Karski could recognize the power of a single individual's courage and perseverance. Through meticulous documentation, repeated testimony, and moral insistence, he had ensured that the world could no longer ignore the systematic destruction unfolding in occupied Poland. The risk, the exhaustion, and the personal toll had been immense, but the transmission of truth had succeeded in piercing the veil of disbelief. Karski understood that the legacy of courage was not measured solely by survival, but by the willingness to confront unimaginable evil and ensure that the world could see, hear, and act. In carrying the stories of Auschwitz to the Allies, he transformed fear into testimony, silence into action, and observation into moral imperative. Jan Karski's journey was a testament to human conscience, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, courage, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to truth can illuminate the path from atrocity to recognition.